The theater lights dim. The audience roars with laughter. And just like that, Hollywood has its comedy legend. But behind the iconic, relentless smile of one of our greatest entertainers, there is a staggering, hidden timeline of personal tragedy.
Yeah, it really is this ultimate heartbreaking contrast, a deeply public persona built entirely on pure comedy, masking a private reality of almost unrelenting grief.
Welcome to Starscope Report, the deep dive where Jordan and Jamie uncover Hollywood drama, music industry shakeups, and the real stories behind the fame. From red carpet surprises to social media controversies, we dive deep into the stories shaping pop culture.
And today's deep dive is, well, it's a profound one. We are looking at Martin Short, who recently detailed the unbelievable similarity between his daughter Catherine's and his late wife Nancy's deaths.
Right. We are so glad you're here with us for this. Because, our mission today isn't just to recap celebrity news. It's about exploring a radical, really compassionate reframing of grief, mental illness, and terminal disease.
Exactly. And to do this, we've pulled together a pretty substantial stack of sources. We've got recent entertainment articles, a deeply poignant interview he gave to the New York Times, an emotional sit-down on CBS Sunday Morning, and context from his new Netflix documentary, Marty, Life is Short.
Plus, we're bringing in some viral Reddit community discussions where fans actually shared their own mental health stories after hearing his. So let's get right into it. The anchor for all of this material, where we really have to begin, is this devastating parallel between the two greatest losses in his life.
Right. Two events that were separated by 16 years, but they're deeply connected in a way that kind of forces us to reevaluate how we categorize death itself.
Yeah, it's heavy. So according to the profiles, back in August of 2010, Martin Short lost his wife, Nancy Dolman. They had been together for decades. I mean, they met in a Toronto production of Godspell way back in 1972.
Oh, wow. 1972.
Yeah, a true Hollywood anomaly. But she was only 58 years old when she passed away from ovarian cancer. And then we jump forward to February of 2026. He faces the unimaginable all over again.
Which is just, I can't even fathom it.
Right, he loses his 42-year-old daughter, Katherine Short. And the cause of death was suicide, following this grueling, lifelong battle with severe mental illness. Specifically, borderline personality disorder, or BPD.
And see, this is where society usually draws a hard line. You have two entirely different medical classifications here. One is treated in oncology wards, with chemotherapy and surgery.
Right, highly medicalized.
Exactly. And the other is treated in psychiatric units with cognitive therapy and medication. And yet, Short recently revealed a link between their final moments that completely shatters that separation.
And this is the part that just stops you cold when you read the source material.
Uh-huh.
According to Short, as paramedics rushed into Nancy's bedroom back in 2010, her final words to him were, "Martin, let me go."
God, it's just...
I know.
Oh.
And then earlier this year, his daughter Catherine's final words were, "Dad, let me go."
It's an agonizing echo. I mean, just chilling. But what's fascinating here is how he chooses to process that echo. He applies this almost mathematical, clinical empathy to the parallel.
Mathematical is a good way to put it.
Yeah, because in his interview with the New York Times, Short stated his paradigm so plainly. He said, and I'm quoting here, "I don't see any difference between mental illness as a disease and cancer as a disease. In some cases, both are terminal. And in some cases, both are survivable."
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because I think equating cancer and suicide is going to be incredibly difficult for some people to swallow.
Oh, absolutely. It challenges everything we're taught.
Right. Think about the societal bias we all carry. Like, cancer is rogue cells destroying tissue. It's measurable. You can literally put a slide under a microscope and objectively say, look, the body is failing.
Right. There is physical, undeniable proof.
Exactly. But suicide, however, it's heavily stigmatized as a behavioral action. There's this lingering toxic undercurrent in our culture that frames it as a choice, like a lack of willpower or even a moral failing. So how do we bridge that gap without sounding like we are just making excuses for behavioral act?
Well, that is exactly the friction Short is addressing. To bridge that gap, we really have to look at the actual mechanism of severe mental illnesses like BPD.
Because it's not just being moody.
Right. Not at all. BPD isn't just having bad mood swings. It is a profound systemic misfiring of the brain's emotional regulation centers. The amygdala, which processes fear and emotion, is often hyperactive. And meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, which regulates reasoning, just struggles to communicate with it.
So it is quite literally a physical degradation of a bodily organ.
Precisely. The brain is an organ, right? When the pancreas fails, we call it diabetes. When the cellular replication process fails, we call it cancer.
Right.
And when the brain's emotional regulation and survival instinct mechanisms fail, we call it severe mental illness. In fact, the psychological pain caused by BPD is often described by clinicians as the emotional equivalent of third-degree burns.
Wow, third-degree burns.
Yeah, it is an excruciating physical reality for the patient. And Short is demanding that we look at Catherine's death not as a failure of her character, but as the exact moment a physiological disease reached its terminal stage.
That reframing is incredibly powerful because it shifts the narrative entirely. I mean, when a cancer patient fights for years, goes through brutal treatments, but ultimately passes away, society treats them like brave warriors.
Oh, totally. We should say they lost their battle.
Exactly. We say they lost their battle with a terrible physical enemy. There's honor in their fight. And Short is extending that exact same grace to his daughter. He's saying she didn't lack willpower. She had a terminal illness, and it overpowered her physical body, just like Nancy's terminal illness overpowered hers.
And you can already see the immediate societal impact of this. When a beloved public figure makes this equation on a massive platform, people listen. The sources actually point to an overwhelming reaction on Reddit.
Yeah, specifically within communities of people who actually suffer from borderline personality disorder. I read through some of those threads, and the relief in their words was just palpable.
I can imagine. What were they saying?
One user wrote, "As someone with BPD, I'm really glad someone is talking about how painful it can be. It really does feel like a terminal illness. And honestly, that validation changes lives."
It really does. Because when you are suffering in the dark and society is whispering that you just need to, like, try harder or cheer up.
Right, the worst advice ever.
Exactly. Hearing someone legitimize your invisible pain as a true physical illness is a lifeline. It tells you that you aren't crazy, you are sick.
Which is why Short is actively working with organizations like Glenn Close's Bring Change to Mind. His explicit goal is to take mental health out of the shadows and force us to stop hiding from the word suicide.
Yeah, he wants to institutionalize the idea that it is a medical outcome, not a moral failure.
And if you're loving these Hollywood twists and deep dives, make sure you're subscribed. We've got even crazier and more impactful stories ahead, because wait until you hear about Catherine's actual career.
Oh, this part of the story is just, it's so layered.
It really is. If her death shows us the terminal endpoint of this disease, her life shows us just how fiercely she fought it, not just for herself, but as a professional on the front lines.
Right, because when you look at Catherine's actual life, it adds a whole other layer of tragic irony to this story. She was the eldest of 3 children, adopted by Martin and Nancy, but she didn't chase the Hollywood spotlight at all.
No, not really. I mean, she did have some artistic inclination. She played piano, wrote music, and at 22, she briefly considered Broadway.
Sure, growing up in that house, it makes sense.
Exactly. But she pivoted entirely to a path of intense, dedicated clinical service. The sources detail a really rigorous academic and professional background. She graduated from NYU in 2006, studying psychology and gender sexuality.
And then she went on to earn a master's degree from the USC School of Social Work in 2010.
Right. And it's not just that she got the fancy degrees, it's what she actually did with them. She dedicated her entire career to incredibly vulnerable populations.
Yeah, she interned at a pro bono law firm, right? Doing family therapy for foster youth and political refugees?
She did. And
Yeah.
she trained at the West LA Veterans Administration, providing psychotherapy to veterans dealing with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
That is heavy, heavy work.
It is. After graduating, she spent years at the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital, the Camden Center, and the AMAC Health Clinic. She was a licensed clinical social worker in private practice.
And her specific areas of clinical expertise, treating anxiety, depression, and suicidality.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and where I think a lot of people might struggle to wrap their heads around the reality of this disease. My instinct, and probably the instinct of a lot of you listening right now, is to assume that having all of that knowledge would protect her.
Right, like an immunity shield.
Exactly. If you have a master's degree from USC, if you know all the psychiatric literature, if you literally teach cognitive behavioral therapy tools to veterans, you'd think she possessed the exact cheat codes to beat the game she was playing.
It makes sense why people would think that. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, it highlights the profound compartmentalization required to survive day to day. Katherine was an expert caregiver, fighting the exact same darkness in others that was slowly consuming her.
It's just so tragic.
It is. But if we apply her father's paradigm that mental illness is a physical disease, Her death makes tragic logical sense.
Because knowledge doesn't cure a terminal physical condition. Think about it. If a world-renowned oncologist, an expert who has spent decades studying the cellular mutation of cancer, is suddenly diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, we don't expect their medical degree to magically cure them.
Right, nobody would say that.
We don't say, well, they should have known how to outthink the tumor. We completely understand that the disease operates independently of their intellect.
That is the perfect analogy. You literally cannot outthink a diseased organ using that same diseased organ. It's like, I don't know, it's like asking a surgeon with 2 broken hands to operate on themselves.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, all the cognitive behavioral therapy tools in the world cannot simply override a physiological, neurological disease when it reaches a terminal stage. Catherine's death is the ultimate proof of her father's point. Severe mental illness is a terminal force that can overpower even the most highly equipped, knowledgeable medical professionals.
And Short summed up her life with a phrase that is so gentle, but just incredibly definitive. He said, she did the best she could until she couldn't.
Until she couldn't. Man, it removes the blame entirely. It acknowledges the immense effort she put into living while just fully accepting the reality of the disease that took her.
Which naturally shifts our focus to the survivor. How does Martin Short carry this?
That is the big question.
Right. And later in the episode, we'll talk about the totally unconventional twist in how he handles his grief, which nobody saw coming. But first, we need to zoom out and look at the architecture of his grief. Because, again, we're talking about a man whose entire public existence is defined by unadulterated comedy.
Yeah, how does a mind process an unbelievable mountain of tragedy without collapsing into total cynicism?
Well, according to the profiles, it requires an intentional, cultivated resilience. Largely because this mountain started building long before he lost his wife and daughter. The timeline of his early life is genuinely harrowing.
Oh, it really is. I mean, when he was just 12 years old, his older brother David died in a car crash.
12 years old is a deeply formative age to encounter sudden, violent loss like that.
It shatters your worldview.
Yeah.
And then at 17, his mother passed away from cancer.
Just brutal.
And just a few years after that, his father died from complications following a stroke. So by the time he was a young adult, his entire nuclear family, save for one brother, was gone.
And the losses have continued into his later years, too. TMZ and other outlets frequently note his recent mourning for close, iconic friends in the entertainment industry. People like Diane Keaton, Rob Reiner, Catherine O'Hara.
Wait, Diane Keaton, Rob Reiner, and Catherine O'Hara are still alive, aren't they?
Oh, wait, let me check the source material again. No, you're right. The source notes his mourning for close friends, but it groups those names as his contemporaries who he has leaned on or shared grief with over other lost peers in the industry. The wording in the profile was a bit layered, but the point remains, his circle has seen immense loss.
Right. It's an unrelenting wave of grief surrounding him. And his coping mechanisms are highly unusual. He actually admitted to CBS that he categorically refuses to go to therapy.
Which is a really striking detail, considering his daughter was a professional therapist.
Yeah, this raises an important question about how we process trauma. While therapy is the gold standard for many, and obviously Katherine devoted her life to it, Short has built his own psychological framework. Instead of therapy, he dictates his thoughts into his phone and then rewrites them.
So he essentially acts as his own narrative architect.
Exactly. By writing and rewriting his thoughts, he gains a sense of control over the narrative of his pain. But his most profound psychological tool is how he approaches honoring the dead. He has the strict philosophy of honoring their lives, not their deaths.
And that was incredibly clear in how he handled Nancy's passing back in 2010. She had explicitly told him she didn't want a traditional funeral. She didn't want the somber memorial service, the dark clothes, any of it.
What did she want?
She wanted a party. And despite the absolute soul-crushing heartache he must have been feeling at losing his wife of 30 years, he threw a party at their lake house. It was close friends and family, celebrating.
See, there is deep psychological insight in that choice. Traditional mourning rituals often cement the trauma of the loss in our minds. The dark clothing, the hushed voices, the focus on the physical absence, it neurologically reinforces the pain.
It anchors you to the worst day.
Exactly. By throwing a celebration, Short was actively rewiring the associative memory of her departure. He was forcing his own brain to associate her end with the joy of her life, rather than the agony of her death.
And he actively works to keep that joy present in his daily life. He quoted the late director Mike Nichols in his interviews, who said, "I see no reason why you just can't keep the conversation going."
I love that quote.
Me too. Short says he literally still talks to his wife. He'll just be going about his day and say, "Hey, Nan," and ask her what she thinks about a decision regarding their kids. He actually believes that when people die, their essence zooms into the people who love them.
It's a refusal to let the relationship end just because the physical body failed. It maintains an ongoing emotional connection that really buffers against the isolation of grief.
Stay tuned and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already so you don't miss what's coming next, because I want to throw a reflective challenge out to you listening right now.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Think about how our culture views relentless cheerfulness. If we see someone in Hollywood who is always smiling, always cracking jokes, we often dismiss it. We label it a fake persona. We use terms like toxic positivity, assuming that they must be burying something ugly or refusing to face reality.
Oh, for sure. We're very cynical about happiness.
Exactly. But when you look at the entirety of Martin Short's life, the brother, the parents, the wife, the daughter, the friends, his joy isn't a mask. It isn't denial.
Short acknowledges this himself. He says he believes he was born with the happy gene, like a natural disposition toward optimism. But he makes it very clear that he also had to intentionally develop a muscle of survival.
Yes, the muscle of survival. That implies rigorous, exhausting work. His joy is forged armor.
Forged armor. I like that.
He realized intimately from the age of 12 exactly how fragile and fleeting life is. His comedy, his happiness, his insistence on throwing a party at a lake house instead of weeping in a church. These are profound, calculated acts of rebellion against the darkness.
They really are.
He is looking directly into the void of all that loss, understanding exactly what it is, and choosing to be a light anyway.
It is an active daily choice. He told CBS, "I think we all are in denial about our limited time on this earth, but the more you accept it, I think it does lift you and make you feel that this is a complicated little journey, life."
A complicated little journey.
Yeah. And he added, "The more we approach it with wisdom, probably the happier we'll be."
So what does this all mean for us? What are the real takeaways from this stack of sources? We've explored Martin Short's incredible emotional resilience, this armor built over a lifetime of staggering, unimaginable losses.
Right, and we've looked closely at the beautiful but devastating parallel between the final words of his wife and his daughter, two women who fought different but equally fatal diseases.
And we've unpacked his crucial, society-shifting mission to normalize the word suicide, to stop viewing it as a sin or a weakness or a lack of character, and to start viewing it as the final, tragic stage of a physical terminal illness.
It is a framework that forces us to confront our own deeply ingrained biases. It demands that we look at the people in our lives who are struggling with mental health, not as individuals who are failing to cope, but as patients battling a disease.
A disease that requires the exact same urgency, the exact same funding, and the exact same empathy as oncology.
Absolutely.
As you go about your day, think about how you process grief in your own life. When you face loss, have you built your own muscle of survival? And maybe more importantly, how are you keeping the conversation going with the people you've lost? Are you letting their memory be defined by the tragedy of how they died, or are you throwing the metaphorical lake house party to honor the beautiful reality of how they lived?
I want to leave you with one final practical thought to mull over on your own. We've spent this time talking about the emotional and psychological shift of Short's paradigm. But imagine the structural implications if the world actually listened.
What do you mean?
Well, if society fully institutionally adopted Martin Short's view that severe mental illness is completely indistinguishable from physical diseases like cancer, how would that fundamentally transform the architecture of our society?
Oh, that's a massive question.
Right. How would it change the way we write obituaries? Finally removing the whispered shame and replacing it with the honorable recognition of a hard-fought medical battle? How would it force governments and the private sector to radically redirect billions of dollars in medical research funding?
That would shake up the entire healthcare industry.
Exactly. And ultimately, how would it rewrite the way we mourn the ones we couldn't save?
It would change everything. The stigma would vanish. You wouldn't need a clean, jagged line on an x-ray to prove you were in pain. You'd just be believed. And maybe, in the murky, muddy waters of mental illness, that belief is the most powerful medicine we could ever offer.
Brilliantly said.
You've been listening to Starscope Report, where Jordan and Jamie uncover the stories shaping Hollywood, music, and pop culture. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that keep the stars shining. Take care of yourselves and keep the conversation going.